Hello and welcome, everyone. My name's Jon Reid. I'm a principal at the International Ethics Standards Board for Accountants, and I'll be the moderator of this webinar. Really pleased to see a large number of participants today from all over the world. We'll just go to the next slide, please. So let me start by just introducing the presenters. So Mark Babington and Szilvia Sramko, who are members of the IESBA Sustainability Task Force and participated in developing IESBA's new standards. Mark is an IESBA member and one of the chairs of the IESBA Sustainability Task Force. He led the workstream responsible for developing the international independent standards for sustainability assurance. Mark is also the Executive Director of Regulatory Standards at the UK Financial Reporting Council. He leads the division responsible for the FRC technical and public policy work covering audit, corporate reporting, corporate governance and stewardship, actuarial and the FRC lab. Szilvia is a principal at the IESBA since 2018, and she's currently involved in the IESBA Sustainability Project with a particular focus on the International Independent Standards for Sustainability Assurance. Szilvia is also involved in the rollout of the IESBA Sustainability Standards. So welcome, Mark and Szilvia, and thank you for joining us. Today, our presenters will provide a deep dive on the International Independent Standards in the IESBA's International Ethics Standards for Sustainability Assurance, or the IESSA. So this webinar is the third in a series of webinars on IESBA Sustainability Week work that we've held this week. Tuesday's webinar covered the IESBA's mission regarding sustainability reporting and assurance, and an overview of the sustainability reporting related revisions to the IESBA code. Yesterday's webinar covered an overview of the key ethics and independence topics in the IESSA. So if we can just go to the next slide. So back to today's session. So as I mentioned, the agenda covers the background to the IESSA, scope and key characteristics of the IESSA, and then a deep dive into the international independent standards in the IESSA. And then finally, we'll finish with the event with a Q&A session. So before we get started, I just wanted to go through a few house rules. If you have any questions at any time during the session, please submit them through the Q&A function in your Zoom control panel. Mark and Szilvia will answer as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. And also just note that our webinar event is being recorded and it will be posted on the IESBA website next week, along with the slides that were used during the presentation today. So without further ado, I now turn to Mark to start the presentation.
Great, thank you very much, Jon, and very pleased to be able to join in this webinar. The first slide I'm going to talk to is really the sort of global baseline that we've been working on providing, and the close coordination that we've had all the way throughout with our colleagues at the IESB. So I very much consider, and I know the rest of the task force does, that the work that IESBA and the IESB have done are a package of global baseline standards. They're intended to work together, and they're very much there to support the developing discipline of sustainability reporting and assurance. Of course, that's not the only work that IESBA has been doing. You'll also be aware of the fact that at the same time that the board approved the changes to the code for sustainability, we also approved changes to the code for using the work of an external expert. And I think that's particularly important because we recognise that in the sustainability landscape, there will be a range of perhaps new and different experts compared to those that we would normally expect to see in the audit of financial statements or in more straightforward assurance engagements. I wanted to say that the project has focused on developing something in very close coordination with the IESB. There have been regular meetings of the board chairs, regular meetings of the task force chairs, and very strong coordination between the staff teams. And I think one of the things that I'm really pleased about is that for the first time, where we're talking about the same thing, the same definition, the same terminology, we are using the same words. So there's no longer an IESBA way of explaining things and an IESB way of explaining things. This is a full package of measures, and it's intended very much that this will support trust and transparency in sustainability reporting. Although the standard has now been approved by the PIOB, so it has gone through all the stages it needs to. The standards are effective from December 2026. Of course, they are available for people to use before that. But one of the things that we will talk about later on is that there are a series of transitional provisions that the board has approved to help with the implementation, particularly around the value chain, which I know many of you commented on in responding to our consultation and also participating in our outreach. If we can go on to the next slide, please. What we're talking about is a new Part 5 for the Code of Ethics. So effectively, if you are a sustainability assurance practitioner, everything is in a one-stop shop, Part 5 of the Code of Ethics. It contains the International Ethics Sustainability Standards for Sustainability Assurance, along with the International Independence Standards, and everything that is within the scope of Part 5 can be accessed through this one section. We use the model of Part 4A for Part 5, so effectively the board took a decision that the high bar that we have for an audit of financial statements in terms of the ethical and independence requirements should also apply to a sustainability engagement. And I think that's a recognition of the fact that this information is increasingly being used for decision making, for capital allocation, and to inform investors in financial markets. So it's particularly important that we were able to provide things in one place. If we can go on to the next slide, please. I just want to, before handing over to Szilvia, run through the key characteristics of what the IESSA has. So as I've said to you, we have equivalent arrangements to the ethics and independence standards that apply in an audit. And I think that's a reflection of the important public interest subject that sustainability is. There's a new part of the code, it's standalone. You don't have to go digging around, it's all in one place. When we were set the challenge of developing the standards by the International Organization of Securities Commissions, one of the things that they asked us to do was develop profession agnostic standards. In some jurisdictions, all of the sustainability assurance work is done by auditors and professional accountants. However, in other jurisdictions, none of the work is done by auditors or professional accountants. And so therefore, in developing the IESSA, we've put forward a standard that can be used by anyone working on sustainability assurance, regardless of their background. And the final thing is that it's also framework neutral. Although our work was in a sense started off by the ISSB's work in developing its first two standards at announced at COP26, our standard is framework neutral and can be used to support reporting using any general purpose framework. But I'm going to pause there and hand over to Szilvia.
Thank you, Mark. Next slide, please. So the IESSA consists of ethics and independence standards. The ethics standards provide the fundamental principles and set out the framework for expected behavior from sustainability assurance practitioners. The ethics standards apply to all sustainability assurance engagement, including limited and reasonable assurance engagement. Given the level of public reliance placed on sustainability disclosures, those performing sustainability assurance engagement should follow stringent ethical requirements. However, adhering to high standards of ethical behavior only when performing sustainability assurance engagement might not sufficiently safeguard stakeholders' confidence and the public interest. For that reason, the IESBA believed that it would be important to hold the practitioners to the same high ethics standards with respect to any other professional services they might provide to the same client. Therefore, the ethics provisions in IESSA apply not only to all sustainability assurance engagement, but any other professional services the sustainability assurance practitioner provides to the same client. However, with respect to the independence standards, the IESBA agreed to a proportionate approach. The board believed that requiring all sustainability assurance practitioners to comply with the independence provision equivalent to the standards for the audit engagement would create too much burden for them, especially for the smaller firms. Therefore, the independent standards in IESSA in Part 5 focus on sustainability assurance engagement with the same level of public interest as audit of the financial statements. These sustainability assurance engagements are where the sustainability information is developed in accordance with a general purpose framework, and the sustainability information is required by law or regulation or otherwise publicly disclosed to support decision-making by investors or other users. And this approach, by the way, is in line with the extant code that also provides different independent standards. In Part 4A, there are standards for audit and review engagement, and in Part 4B, there are independent standards for assurance engagements other than audit and review engagements. But this approach doesn't mean that the IESBA code would not provide independence provisions in the context of other sustainability assurance engagements that are not within the scope of Part 5, such as sustainability assurance engagement, where the sustainability information was developed in accordance with a special purpose framework, or reports with restrictions on use. The independent standards in Part 4B is already there and apply to assurance engagements other than audit and review engagements. And it continues to apply for professional accountants when they perform these other sustainability assurance engagements. And the sustainability assurance practitioners who are not professional accountants are also encouraged to comply with the independent standards in this part, in Part 4B. Of course, going forward, as a next step, the IESBA will consider developing profession-agnostic independent standards for these other sustainability assurance engagement as well as part of its next strategy and work plan. But during this webinar today, we will discuss the key topics in the international independent standards in Part 5. Next slide, please. One of the key objectives of IESBA sustainability project was that the same robust ethics and independent standards need to underpin the assurance of sustainability information that currently apply to the audit of the financial statements. Therefore, the premise of IESBA's work while developing the independent standards in Part 5 was that the relationships, the interest, and the circumstances that might create threats to independence in the context of an audit engagement might also create threats in the context of sustainability assurance engagements. Accordingly, the independent standards in IESSA in Part 5 addresses the same areas that the independent standards in Part 4A applicable to audit engagements, such as you can see on the right side of the slide, this includes financial relationships and business relationships with the client, previous employment with the client, or family and personal relationship. However, the independent standards in IESSA goes beyond that, and it recognizes that there are some threats related to the sustainability specific characteristics of the engagements, such as the different subject matter, namely the sustainability information, and the different reporting boundary, since the sustainability information includes information from up and down the value chain. Therefore, the independent standards in the IESSA in Part 5 includes the definition of sustainability information and other sustainability-related terms. It addresses the group sustainability assurance engagement and the value chain component, the independence considerations related to using the work of another practitioner, and provision of sustainability-related non-assurance services, such as sustainability data and information services. And it also addresses independence issues arising when a firm performs both audit and sustainability assurance engagements, such as how to deal with fees from the same client or the long association with the client. And later on, we will talk about all these specific issues in details. But first of all, and the next slide, please. So first of all, the independent standards in Part 5 requires the sustainability assurance practitioner to be independent of the sustainability assurance client. This is a key overarching requirement in all independent standards. Regarding the sustainability assurance client, the independent standards in the IESSA does not only focus on the entity on whose sustainability information the firm expresses an opinion, but it also includes its related entities. The number of the related entities involved depends on whether the client is a publicly traded entity or not. But the determination of the client's related entities is equivalent to the audit engagements. Therefore, the related entities for the audit of the financial statements and for the sustainability assurance engagements are the same. The independent standards in IESSA also provides a scalable approach and determines different requirements depending on whether the client is a public interest entity, a PI, or not. This determination is mainly relevant to the provisions of non-assurance services to the client, the partner rotation, or certain other areas, such as the public disclosure of fees. But what are the public interest entities in IESSA? The IESBA recognized that stakeholders have heightened expectations depending on the nature of the entity and its sustainability information. The IESBA proposed that an entity be treated as a public interest entity for the purposes of the sustainability assurance engagement if it has been determined as such for the purposes of the audit engagement too. And these entities are, as you can see on the slide, the publicly traded entities with the main function to take deposits from the public, entity with the main function to provide insurance to the public, and any other entities designated as a PI in the specific jurisdiction for the purposes of the audit engagement. And this decision to use the same public interest entity definition was not driven by the financial condition of these entities. The IESBA recognized that there might be other factors that could influence the significance of the public interest in an entity in the context of a sustainability assurance engagement. However, the IESBA considered that there would be a potential for confusion if an entity was determined to be a public interest entity only on the basis of its sustainability information, when it is not a public interest entity for the purposes of the audit of the financial statement, especially on a global level. But still, the jurisdictions could determine that an entity is a public interest entity for the purposes of the sustainability assurance, but only in that specific jurisdiction. And I would stop here and turn to Mark.
Thank you, Szilvia. If we can move on to the next slide, please. One of the things that perhaps you've seen as one of the biggest changes since we went out to exposure has been the alignment of the approach of the IAASB and IESBA over group sustainability assurance engagements. So effectively, we now have a common approach, the same approach for each board and each standard, with common group-related definitions. So within a group, we have two things: group components and value chain components. In the case of a group component, it's going to be determined by the boundary of the reporting entity's group financial statements. So if you are consolidated into a set of group accounts, you are a group component for the purposes of the sustainability assurance engagement. A value chain component is a component within the value chain, but something that's not included within the boundary of the group financial statements. So it's a way of distinguishing between the two and also helping people to apply the different independence requirements that apply as a result. So the IESSA contains effectively three areas of independence requirements. Firstly, the independence considerations where you have a group sustainability assurance firm. And again, that's very much building on that model that we talked about earlier. It's derived from the audit of financial statements. And then you have the requirements that apply to component practitioners. Now, those can be from within the group sustainability assurance firm's network, or they can be other providers from outside of that network. And Szilvia is going to talk more about those later on. And then, of course, they also are the independence considerations as they apply to the group sustainability assurance team. The independence considerations that apply for assurance work are different for a group component and a value chain component. And this is one of the areas that the board decided to reflect as a result of the engagement and outreach that we carried out following our exposure draft and our very broad consultation. So what you'll see is there are independence provisions that are essentially akin to an audit of financial statements that apply to a group component. However, those that apply in the context of a value chain component are far more proportional and have been stripped down in a way to still support public confidence in that engagement, but not to be overly onerous and burdensome. And I think it's important to say one of the things that we were very aware of is we didn't want to create a situation where we had independence requirements where people then said, no one is independent to do this work, or no one at least is able to prove they are independent to be able to do this work. So that's been a really important consideration all the way through. In terms of how this approach applies, if we can move to the next slide, please. One of the terms that does a lot of leverage in the standard now is it's driven by activities performing assurance work at a component. And how does that work? So in the international independence standards, we use the term performing assurance work at, and that's what determines the independence provisions that you comply with. It also ensures that we have consistency. So firstly, I think one of the really important things to stress is performing assurance work at does not require you to be physically present to perform assurance work. Effectively, from the group, for the requirements that apply will be driven by what the group firm has determined is necessary to perform assurance procedures at a component to gain evidence. So it's always going to be a consideration of the group firm and about what they require to complete their engagement. And I think one of the things that is really important to stress within the context of how this works is, are the assurance procedures being performed on data or information maintained by that component? So effectively what you've got are some clear sort of guardrails over how you actually operationalize the requirements of the IESSA in a sustainability assurance engagement. I want to now go on to just illustrate how the independence requirements apply, and that's on the next slide, please. But one of the things I would really encourage all of you to read if you get an opportunity is please take a look at the basis for conclusions. There is a table in the back of the basis of conclusions and some very helpful flow diagrams, and those show you in a tabular form how independence requirements do or don't apply to different parts of a group engagement. And that's a very simple one-page table. And certainly in the outreach that I've been involved in this week in Australia, that has been one of the things that people have commented is particularly helpful. So if we can move on to the independence requirements on the next slide, please. You'll see that effectively there are two delineations that operate within the IESSA. So the first of those is the independence requirements for firms participating in a group sustainability assurance engagement. And these apply, and this is section 5405 of the standard. These apply where the group firm is able to be sufficiently and appropriately involved in the assurance work throughout those components. So effectively, in old terminology, are they able to direct, supervise and review that work? And you'll see what we've shown there, and it's one of the things that we've taken from the basis for conclusion, is there's a flow diagram there that takes you through the decision process in the IESSA. So firstly, can the group provider be sufficiently and appropriately involved? If yes, you're in 5405. And then is the assurance work being performed at the client, including a group component or a value chain component? And you'll see there the independence requirements that apply if you're a group component and the independence requirements that apply at a value chain component. And as I've said earlier, you'll see that the requirements that apply in the context of a firm, a component practitioner within the network, or a component practitioner outside of the network have been really stripped back to focus on independence from the value chain component itself and nothing further. So, you know, we got a lot of feedback through the consultation process. We really listened and considered that carefully. And we hope that what we now have is a pragmatic and proportionate approach for value chain engagements. The focus is always going to be on the independence of the practitioner performing the work. So there are no independence requirements in a value chain component for network firms. Independence is only in respect to the value chain, not its upstream or downstream entities. And the application is in respect of non-PI provisions only. So that provides a very much streamlined and practical way of applying the requirements in the context of these engagements. I'm now going to hand back to Szilvia for the next section.
So the next slide, yes, thank you. It's about using the work of another practitioner. So IESSA 5000 recognizes the concept that a firm might wish to use the work of another practitioner, but sometimes the firm cannot be sufficiently and appropriately involved in the work of these practitioners who are, in some instances, have already carried out the assurance work with respect to a group client or a value chain component. So they are not component practitioners, as Mark has mentioned. But if the firm still intends to use the work of these other practitioners for the purposes of the sustainability assurance engagement, the IESSA 5000 sets out specific conditions for that. These conditions include that the firm needs to comply with the relevant ethical requirements. And these relevant ethical requirements are provided in the IESSA. Since the firm cannot be sufficiently and appropriately involved in the work of the practitioner, the premise of IESBA's work was that the IESSA couldn't directly impose requirement on another practitioner who might not even be subject to the code. Therefore, the sustainability assurance practitioner remains ultimately responsible for that other practitioner's work and the practitioner's independence. The IESSA provides different requirements depending on whether the sustainability assurance practitioner uses the assurance work or other type of non-assurance work of the other practitioner. If the firm uses the assurance work of another practitioner that you can see on the top of the slide, the international independence standards in IESSA requires the firm to be satisfied that the other practitioner meets the independence requirements in IESSA with respect to that entity or component at which the assurance work is performed. However, if the firm uses the non-assurance work, the IESBA considered that it would not be proportionate to require the firm to be satisfied about the other practitioner's independence in accordance with Part 5. Therefore, the IESBA developed guidance in the ethics standards of the IESSA that requires the sustainability assurance practitioner to exercise professional judgment to determine appropriate steps to fulfill the sustainability assurance practitioner's responsibility to comply with the fundamental principles when using the non-assurance work of that practitioner. So this guidance really relies on exercising professional judgment. And the guidance also includes specific examples of factors that the firm might consider when determining such steps, such as the reputation and the competence of the other practitioner, or whether that other practitioner is subject to applicable professional and ethics standards. Next slide, please. So further on, I will talk about the independence considerations applicable when using the assurance work of another practitioner. And this diagram in the slide is from the appendix of the basis conclusions, also as Mark mentioned, and it demonstrates the applicable provisions when the firm determines to use the assurance work of another practitioners, and it goes through the same steps that Mark mentioned before. The applicable independence provisions will depend on whether the other practitioner performs assurance work at a group client, including a group component, or at a value chain component, as you can see in the last row of this diagram. Regarding the client and the group components, in limited circumstances, especially at the beginning of an engagement, IESSA 5000 provides the option for the firm to use the assurance work of another practitioner for the purposes of the sustainability assurance engagement. And in those cases, there are specific communication requirements, and the firm needs to confirm that the practitioner and the individuals from that practitioner who perform the assurance work meet the independence requirements in IESSA with respect to the entity. However, this doesn't mean that the other practitioner needs to be subject to the IESSA. The other practitioner might comply with other ethics and independence requirements in professional standards, for example. But these standards need to be at least as demanding as IESSA if the firm would like to use that work. And if the firm uses the assurance work of another practitioner at the value chain component that you can see on the right side, the IESSA sets out an even more proportionate approach. In the case of a value chain component, there are no specific communication requirements. The IESBA believed that requiring communication on a case-by-case basis would not be a pragmatic approach, and it could be burdensome. Therefore, in the case of a value chain component, the IESSA provides the option for the firm to rely on the other practitioner's statement of independence to comply with these requirements. And also, the other practitioner needs to be independent only of the value chain component at which the assurance work is performed, but not from any of the components related entities or up and down the value chain. In addition, the other practitioner needs to be independent in accordance with the provisions that apply to that entity and not to the client. So if the entity or the component is not a public interest entity, but the client is a public interest entity, the other practitioner needs to meet the provisions that apply to the non-PI clients. So, but this last point is, by the way, applicable to both group components and value chain components. And next slide, please. Finally, the effective date. As explained at the previous webinars this week, the IESBA agreed to align the effective date of IESSA with IESSA 5000. Therefore, the independence regime in the IESSA is effective for assurance engagements on sustainability information for periods beginning on or after December 15, 2026, or as at a specific date on or after December 15, 2026. However, while developing the independence provisions for value chain components at which assurance work is performed, There were some concerns from stakeholders around the developing regulatory environment and reporting landscape in relation to value chain and how the assurance practice might evolve. Responding to such concerns, the IESBA agreed to provide an additional 18 months with respect to the value chain components to support and facilitate the market transition to the independence regime. And this extended period will also enable the IESBA, in coordination with IAASB, to monitor the evolution of assurance practice with respect to the performance of assurance work at the value chain component and consider the need for any response in the light of the developments. So accordingly, the IESBA decided to allow the option for a longer effective date for the provisions applicable to assurance work performed at a value chain component. This means the relevant provisions in section 5405 and 5406. And these provisions will be effective for sustainability assurance engagement on sustainability information for periods beginning on and after 1st of July 2028. However, if the firm decides to use this deferred effective date, the firm still needs to meet with certain conditions. The group firm or the component practitioner still needs to apply the conceptual framework in relation to the assurance work performed at the value chain component. And if the group firm intends to use the assurance work of another practitioner performed at the value chain component, the group firm needs to be satisfied that the other practitioner is independent. However, in that regard, the firm may rely on a statement of independence in accordance with Part 4B or other professional requirements relating to the independence. Plus, in the interest of transparency, the group firm needs to publicly disclose the fact that the independence provisions for assurance work performed at a value chain component in the IESSA have not been applied just yet. So they need to be transparent about using this deferred effective date. And with that, I stop here and turn back to Mark.
Thank you, Szilvia. So one further slide from me, if we can just move forward, please. This concerns the provision of non-audit services to sustainability assurance clients. And if you look at the tiles on the right-hand side of this slide, for those of you who use the code regularly, it will all look very familiar. So what we've done is to leverage the approach regarding the provision of NAS to sustainability clients that applies in the context of an audit client. And I think one of the things that perhaps I should have said earlier on is that when you look at Part 5, if the number has just got a 5 in front of it, so say it's 5603, it lifts 603 from Part 4 of the code. So only where we've put in additional requirements would you find additional A and B paragraphs. So, you know, you are in very familiar territory. But of course, we have done some tailoring of the NAS provisions to reflect that sustainability information that's subject to an assurance opinion will be different in a sustainability type engagement to an audit engagement. And I think one of the clearest examples there is we've changed a reference to valuation services that exists within an audit to a reference to advisory services on forward-looking information, because of course we're looking here at a far more sort of forward-looking engagement in terms of the assurance of information than perhaps in an audit of financial statements. So you're in familiar territory if you're an auditor or if you're an auditor of financial statements. The same general provisions apply. There's a prohibition from assuming any management responsibility. You have to consider the self-review threat. And indeed, many of the discussions that we've had have been about what work can a practitioner carry out to help their clients prepare for the first round of sustainability assurance engagements. And of course, there's still the requirement for communication with those charged with governance. In terms of prohibitions, We've got no new prohibitions. So the prohibited NAS that apply in the audit in an audit engagement have been replicated here. But as I say, what we have done is we've tailored the requirements so they are sustainability specific and they're relevant. And you'll see all of those sort of within the text of that section. One further thing, Sylvia's already talked you through the general transitional provisions. There's a transitional provision for NAS. So where you have a NAS service that's in flight that would not be allowed under Part 5 of the code, but you've already entered into it, you can continue to provide it for one more reporting cycle. And this is a consideration that the board took to stop a disorderly exit of the provision of services at an important time when there's significant transition going on. So that's the approach for NAS. But as I say, you'll see that it's very familiar with what you're used to seeing in an audit of financial statements. If we can go on to the next slide, and I'm going to hand over to Szilvia for that and wind up.
Thank you, Mark. So yes, this is our last topic for today, and it's about performing both services to the client. So given the interconnectivity between the financial statements and the sustainability information, the IESBA acknowledged the benefit of the auditor providing sustainability assurance engagement to the audit client, and the IESSA does not prohibit or restrict in any way that the same firm provides the audit and the sustainability assurance engagement to the client. However, the independent standards in IESSA addresses certain independence matters and provide guidance when the firm provides both engagements. And one of these areas is when the client receives fees for audit and sustainability assurance engagement separately from the same client. The independent standards in IESSA treats fees for sustainability assurance engagement within the scope of the independent standards in Part 5 and the audit fees the same way. Consequently, when the firm is considering whether a large proportion of fees for services other than audit to audit fees create threats to independence, the firm should not consider the fees for the sustainability assurance engagement that is within the scope of the independent standards in Part 5. Since the IESBA's objective was that the same independent standards apply to both audit and sustainability assurance engagements within the scope of the independent standards in Part 5, the IESBA accepted the view that the relative proportion of audit fees and fees for such sustainability assurance engagement wouldn't create a threat. However, the firm still needs to consider the fees for sustainability assurance engagement under Part 4B and whether receiving a large proportion of such fees from an audit client could create a threat. The IESSA also set out disclosure of fees for sustainability assurance engagements that are within the scope of the independent standards in Part 5, and the disclosure to those charged with governance and to the public. However, it is only required, equivalent to the audit fees, if the client didn't disclose such information before. So when the firm provides both audit and sustainability assurance engagements, the IESSA still requires the disclosure of the fees for the audit of the financial statements separately. The IESBA took into account that in practice, the audit and the sustainability assurance engagement are generally separate engagements, and in jurisdictions that require the disclosure of fees, law and regulation generally mandates the disclosure of fees for the audit of the financial statements separately or only. The other area that the IESSA addresses is the long association. The independent standards in IESSA addresses the circumstances when the auditor later becomes the provider of the sustainability assurance engagement, or vice versa, and the extended period of the relationship, the long association, potentially creates familiarity and self-interest threats to the independence. The IESSA and the standards for audit engagement, so both standards, treat the audit engagement and the sustainability assurance engagement within the scope of the independent standards in Part 5 as equivalent when considering the threats created by long association. This means that the firm needs to consider the years spent on both engagements when considering the time on and the cooling off period. And similar to NAS, the IESBA provided transitional provisions for the long association situations if the firm started the sustainability assurance engagement before the effective date and the firm was not the auditor of the client before. So this was our last topic, and I would stop here and turn back to Jon for any questions that we might receive.
Okay, thank you, Mark and Szilvia. That's a really informative presentation, so I appreciate that. Now we have some time to respond to some questions. We've had quite a few questions that have come through the Q&A session, through the Q&A button, and whilst you guys have been speaking. So we'll start with some of those questions now. The first one I'll address to you, Mark, if that's okay. So the first question is, why did the IESBA decide to provide independence requirements when assurance work is performed at a value chain component that can be, for example, a supplier or a customer? There are no such requirements in the case of audit engagements with respect to suppliers and customers. How is it different in the case of a sustainability assurance engagement?
Well, I think I'd start off by saying the difference is that the reporting framework that applies in sustainability engagements actually has value chain reporting in it as a specific sort of set of the overall reporting requirements. So the value chain is part of the reporting package. It's also part of the assurance package. So the IASB have specifically included the value chain within ISSA 5000. So as a result, IESBA cannot ignore the value chain for the purposes of ethics and independence standards. However, we do recognise that the nature of the engagement is a slightly different one, and therefore that's why we have decided to apply a more proportionate and scaled down set of independence requirements. At its core, where someone is carrying out an assurance engagement within the value chain, they are still providing assurance. So therefore, for public confidence and for the public interest, it's appropriate that that provider is independent and is obviously following appropriate ethical requirements. So that's why we did it. We can't leave it out because it's part of the reporting and the assurance package.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. Another question, Szilvia, I'll address this one to you. So Part 4A in respect of non-PI and non-publicly traded audit clients, and it doesn't impose any restrictions on non-assurance services in respect of the parent of the audit client. Why do the new standards impose restrictions on all related entities, including any, regardless of materiality, parent, investors and sister entities?
If I understand the questions correctly, I think there's no difference between the two standards, between the audit and the new Part 5 with respect to the treatment of the PIs and the related entities. So the number of related entities depends on whether the entity is a publicly traded entity or not. And there is no changes to the definition of the related entities. As I mentioned, the related entities are the same for the audit engagement and the sustainability assurance engagement. So unless I misunderstand that question, my response is there is no difference in the treatment.
Okay, thank you very much, Szilvia. Mark, we have a question here which relates to the PI definition, so I'll direct this one to you. Given that the PI definition doesn't refer to Part 5, how are we comfortable that non-accounting or assurance providers who may only read Part 5 will know what a PI is?
Well, firstly, John, I think the term public interest entity is pretty well established, and for those who aren't aware of it, there's a really helpful set of material on the IESBA website to help people with the applicability of the PI provisions within the code. So certainly that would be a good place to start if you were concerned about that. But in a sense, the determination of what is a PI is in a sense a matter of fact that your client will actually know where they fall in respect of the line. And I think Szilvia already set out earlier in her presentation why we followed the particular approach that we did. But the PI requirements for IESBA are comparatively recent. And one of the things that was a really important consideration for us was to do nothing that unpicked those while they're still bedding in and developing. And therefore, we should take an approach that leverage that. But I say there's lots of material. And I suppose we should also acknowledge, Szilvia, that IESBA is producing a lot of wider implementation support material that will also be there to support the application of Part 5 of the code more widely.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. Szilvia, I'll address the next question to you. If a sustainability assurance engagement in a certain jurisdiction can only be performed by a professional accountant, can that jurisdiction decide not to apply the IESSA, as in Part 5, and require the Code of Ethics without Part 5 to be valid for the sustainability assurance as well? Is this for sustainability assurance engagement sufficient or acceptable to meet the ethical and independence requirements?
That's an interesting question. Of course, IESBA has no remit to dictate or to tell the jurisdictions what set of standards they adopt. So as we mentioned before many times, that there was the objective to have the equivalent standards developed for sustainability assurance engagement as for the audit. So Part 5 and Part 4A is equivalent at the moment. But if someone is just applying Part 4A for these sustainability assurance engagements, there are certain elements that are not there. As I mentioned, that Part 5 specifically addresses issues related to the sustainability specific characteristic of such engagements, such as the value chain or services, special non-assurance services. So if one jurisdiction decides not to adopt Part 5, it's not something that the IESBA can tell anything about, but I believe that the reason we developed these new standards is really to help sustainability assurance engagements to have a profession agnostic standards that is fit for purpose for sustainability assurance engagements.
Thank you very much, Szilvia. Mark, we have another question. I'll address this one to you if that's okay. So if a client or jurisdiction chooses to apply ISA 5000 early, are they also required to apply the IESSA requirements, or does this depend on the facts and circumstances?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that question, because that's I think very much what's happening in Australia at the moment, and I've been talking to stakeholders today. So the law has now set out the requirements that apply in Australia. Effectively, the Australian Auditing and Assurance Standards Board has approved an Australian version of ISSA 5000 for use, and that will apply to engagements for periods that have already started. So in Australia, that standard refers to the code, and it's a matter of national law or regulation. So we are they're providing a global standard. If jurisdictions want to use that early, then they're of course perfectly free to do so. And we've always been very clear that, you know, the use of the standard and its wider application will be determined by jurisdictions. We're the facilitator who makes it available.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. Szilvia, another question's come through. I'm struggling to understand the logic regarding fee dependence. Perhaps I misunderstood. Are the fees for audit and sustainability assurance engagements for the same client consolidated to determine fee dependence?
If I understand correctly, the question is about the total amount of fees from one client and the dependency of fees. And the question is, yes, so the firm needs to consider all the fees received from the same client, whether if it's for audit engagements, sustainability assurance engagements within the scope of Part 5, or other type of assurance engagement, then determining whether there is a large amount from that client that would compromise the firm's independence.
Thank you very much, Szilvia. Mark, another question. This is regarding long association and familiarity threat. Regarding the long association and familiarity threat, is there a regulatory rotation for high clients similar to the financial statement audit clients?
So effectively, we have modelled the approach on what currently applies in the audit of financial statements. So that's the approach that we've leveraged. Although, as many people will be aware, sometimes in national jurisdictions, tighter requirements apply over rotation than apply in the code. So it might be a shorter timetable, or there might be a national procedure to go through. But effectively, what we've done is we've leveraged the audit approach and also used that for sustainability engagements. That also reflects the fact that someone who has been the auditor can transfer across to be a sustainability assurance engagement lead, as long as they've not had too long an exposure to that client. But what it does mean is that they can't ping pong backwards and forwards doing a different engagement, but always staying with the same entity. But I think one of the things that we'd have to advise people to do is be very aware of your own jurisdictional requirements, because sometimes they may be tighter than the ones that are specified in the code.
Excellent, thank you, Mark. I might direct this one to you as well, Mark. I think it probably relates more to you. Are you able to share more around the services that are permitted in helping clients in their readiness for sustainability assurance?
Sorry, John, can you repeat that? You just faded a little bit.
Yeah, that's fine, no problem. Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah.
Okay, the question is, are you able to share more around the services that are permitted in helping clients in their readiness for sustainability assurance?
Well, I don't think there is a list of definitive permitted services. I think one of the things is you need to leverage the approach in the code and the conceptual framework in particular. So, you know, if you are helping your client to prepare and to get ready for sustainability reporting and assurance, is there a risk that anything you do will actually cause a self-review threat when you later come on and undertake assurance work on that component? So I think one of the things, and I should have said this earlier on, when we started this project, we looked at the sort of underpinning conceptual framework and the fundamental principles of the code, and we asked ourselves, are these suitable for a sustainability assurance engagement? And we concluded very quickly that they were. They're very strong foundations, and that's the approach you need to leverage. So consider whether or not the provision of any sort of support work in getting people ready would provide a self-review threat that you couldn't then safeguard.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mark. Szilvia, I'll direct this question to you. The effective date for these standards is 15 December 2026. What happens to engagements that happen before that date? Will the standards be applied retrospectively?
So obviously, we don't want a retrospective application of the code, but that's why we provided certain transitional provisions, just as Mark mentioned, especially in the case of non-assurance services. But also, the code includes a guidance with respect to services that the firm provided to an entity before the entity became a client. So this is a general guidance for these situations that the firm needs to consider when engaging to an engagement, or when engaging to perform a sustainability assurance engagement with a client.
Thank you, Szilvia. Mark, a bit of an interesting question here, so I'll direct this to you. Can you confirm that using non-assurance work of another practitioner includes using Part 4B assurance work done by the practitioner and not necessarily NAS as typically thought of?
That's a tricky one to unpack, John, because of course, if it's something that's done under 4B, there are no non-assurance services in that context. So I think what I would say is that, you know, obviously Szilvia explained earlier in the presentation the requirements that apply when you propose to place reliance on the work of another practitioner. So those are set out in these slides, and obviously are also dealt with in the code itself and will be dealt with in our implementation support material. That also covers the fact that there will be examples where practitioners choose to rely on factual pieces of work that are not assurance, but are wider things that are used to inform the engagement that they actually undertake. But I think, you know, I would encourage people to follow the flow diagram that Szilvia was using earlier when she was talking about this, because you can ask yourself the questions that are at each level of that, and then that will help you determine the independence requirements that apply in that context.
Thank you very much, Mark. Okay, Szilvia, there's a question for you. So IESSA doesn't apply to all sustainability assurance engagements. Why did the IESBA decide to focus only on specific engagements? Is it in line with the objective to create a level playing field for all sustainability assurance practitioners?
It's a really good question. And as I mentioned before, the IESBA decided to take a proportionate approach when determining the scope of the international independent standards in Part 5. And this is because the IESBA felt that requiring the application of the more stringent independence requirements, so the independence requirements that are as high level as the audit engagement, that would create quite a lot of burden for smaller firms. So that's why our intention was to determine that what are those engagement, those sustainability assurance engagement that has the same level of public interest and as audit engagement. And these are what I have just mentioned, that sustainability assurance engagements where the sustainability information was, one, developed under general purpose framework, and two, it is required by law or regulation or otherwise publicly disclosed to support the decision making. So if the engagement, the sustainability assurance engagement, mean these two criteria, that they are under the scope of Part 5. And if they don't meet these criteria, they would fall within the scope of the international independent standards in Part 4B. So it's nothing from the level playing field. It's really to be considerate that it wouldn't be in the public interest to require the application of these more stringent rules for engagement where the public interest is not necessarily there.
Okay, thanks very much, Szilvia. Mark, we'll address the next question to you. So the question we have is, has the IESBA considered or prepared any impact analysis regarding the administrative task, the identification and database on value chain components would create?
There's not a specific impact assessment, John, if that's what people are asking for. However, we did carry out very extensive outreach and a lot of engagement, and we also drew on a sustainability reference group to help us develop the proposals that are in the IESSA. So one of the benefits of having all of that outreach is it's helped the board in scaling its approach. So where we have put independence requirements in place for value chain engagements, as we've both sort of spoken about in this presentation, we've deliberately targeted those to be quite narrow, more straightforward for a provider to apply, and it's certainly something that is not an onerous obligation that we put upon them. So there's not a document that people can look at per se, but they can certainly look back at the impact, and part of that is recorded in the basis for conclusions about how all of that feedback and that engagement that we had helped us in terms of finalising the proposals.
That's great. Thank you very much, Mark. Szilvia, another one's just come in. I'll direct this to you if that's okay. So regarding the value chain, during the transitional period, it seems to be sufficient to apply the general conceptual framework in terms of safeguarding independence. Why did the IESBA not find this approach to be a sufficient solution for the code even after the transitional time period?
That's again a really good question, and it relates to, I believe, one of the conditions to choose the deferred effective date for assurance work performed at a value chain component, when it's one of the conditions that the firm or a component practitioner still needs to comply with the conceptual framework with respect to that work. And one of the reasons, but I might turn to Mark as well, one of the reasons we decide to not to use the application of the conceptual framework only, because there is a public interest to have specific provisions, and it also going to promote the consistent application of the independence provisions. Once we went out in the ED, we had a similar approach. It's not the conceptual framework, but using the knows or reason to believe test. And the feedback we have heard from stakeholders that it is not helpful and there would be a risk of inconsistent application. So we believe that setting out these specific provisions for value chain components when the assurance work is performed at the value chain components is really in the public interest. So it's not the question what is sufficient, is not sufficient, is more about the consistent application and having a robust independent standards out there when assurance work is performed at the value chain component.
Okay, thank you, Szilvia. The next question, I might also address this one to you, Szilvia, sort of related more back to your part of the presentation. So in the case, so it's a bit of a long question, so bear with me. In the case of using the assurance work of another practitioner, it was mentioned that it's not necessary for the practitioner to be subject to the IIA or the International Independence Standards in Part 5, but the firm can confirm the practitioner's independence if the practitioner complies with independence standards that are at least as demanding as the international standards in Part 5, International Independence Standards. Can this standard be the International Independence Standards in Part 4B? And if the practitioner is subject to other professional standards, is it whose responsibility to determine whether the standard is at least as demanding?
Oh, I hope I could capture everything. So the response, yeah, as I mentioned, there is a requirement for the firm to confirm that the other practitioner meets the independence requirements in Part 5. So that doesn't mean that the other practitioner needs to be subject to Part 5. However, if the other practitioner is subject to other professional standards, these standards needs to be at least as demanding as IESSA. And it is not on the firm or not on the other practitioner to make that assessment. It is in the regulators or the adequate authorities in the specific jurisdiction to determine that what are those professional standards out there in that specific jurisdiction that are at least as demanding as the IESSA. And I think there was another part of the question regarding the Part 4B. So complying with Part 4B wouldn't be sufficient because Part 5 and Part 4B are not equivalent. However, in the transitional provisions of the IESSA, the IESBA recognized that there might be engagements carried out by the other practitioner in accordance with Part 4B, and the firm would like to use these engagements. So there is a transitional provision that if the other practitioners comply with Part 4B, that is also sufficient, but only if we are talking about early adoption. So if the firm adopts the IESSA before 2026 and would like to use the work of another practitioner, and that other practitioner is subject to Part 4B or complies with Part 4B, that is in this transitional provision. But after 2026, we believe that this effective date provides sufficient time to prepare for those situations. I think that was all of that. Okay.
Thank you very much, Szilvia. We've only have a few more minutes. So I'll just do one last question. I'll address this one to you, Mark. The question is, there are still some jurisdictions where national laws and regulations do not require sustainability reporting yet, and reporting entities disclose their sustainability information and obtain assurance reports on those on a voluntary basis. Does that mean, so the question is, does that mean that such voluntary reports are not within the scope of the International Independent Standards in Part 5?
So go back through the criteria, John, that we use for deciding. So firstly, has the information been prepared in accordance with the general purpose framework? And, you know, we're already aware of a lot of companies who, in the absence of particular reporting requirements in their jurisdiction, have said, we are going to follow this framework for our reporting. And then, of course, we said that criteria that applies then is it required by law or regulation? Well, no, it isn't. But is it required? Is it publicly available to support decision making? So again, you know, I think one of the things that's really helpful about the IESSA is these criteria give you effectively a decision tree that you can work through. So, you know, and also one of the things I'd say is that, you know, Part 5 does give you a high bar. And I think that, you know, people will be encouraging the use of that high bar to ensure the provision of high quality assured information.
That's great. Thank you very much, Mark. Well, we've now come to the end of the session today. So thank you, Mark and Szilvia, for your excellent presentation and all your responses to quite a large number of questions that we've got. So appreciate that. And also thank you to everyone for joining us today. So just as a reminder, the recording of the webinar and the slides will be available on the IESBA's website next week. And if you want to access this or other useful supporting material relevant to the IESBA sustainability standards, so make sure you visit our website. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind you that we had 2 other webinars this week on the IESBA sustainability reporting related revisions to the code, and also an overview of the key ethics and independence topics in the IESSA, which will also be available on the IESBA's website. So thank you, and have a wonderful rest of the day, and goodbye to all.